I'd like to welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whoever you love and whatever you believe, you're welcome here. Today is the 26th Biblical Scholarship and Literacy lecture. Today we're going to talk about the Book of Numbers. We're just going to give an introduction to the text. One of the texts in Book of Numbers is used as a proof text by people for and against abortion, so we're going to take a small digression once we get there to discuss abortion in general. If you're here specifically looking for that, if you're watching online especially, I'll try to put a link so you can skip some of the other material. If that part's not interesting to you, you can skip to the abortion section. But if you're here for the Book of Numbers, then we'll start there. I also want to remind everyone that we have a class webpage. This is the URL. It has links to all the lectures, and it has sometimes the handouts, links to the handouts, that sort of thing. And it's supposed to have a calendar that's up to date, but I've been fairly bad at keeping the calendar up to date. I'll try to work on that a little bit harder. But I apologize that the URL is difficult to find. Sites.google.com, view Biblical Scholarship and Literacy. That's because that's free, so I don't have a good URL for that. But today, we're going to review what we did. We're going to do an introduction to the Book of Numbers. We're going to try to cover the text of Numbers 1 through 10, and then we're going to cover Numbers 5, which is the section that's related to abortion, in a little bit more detail. So, to review, last time we finished the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus was done in several sections. Leviticus 1 through 15 was P's instructions for the priest, P being one of the sources. We'll talk a little bit more about textual sources in a minute. Then we did Leviticus 16. It got its own lecture. That one's on the Day of Atonement. We did that November 20th, and then in January we did Leviticus 17 through 27, which was the Holiness Code. Now, we described the book of Leviticus as something like the Vedas in Hinduism. It's a book that describes the holiness laws and the rituals for the priests specifically. And P is the author of most of it, and it has this section with where we believe it's a separate author, which we label H. He's related to P, but there are some differences in those laws. We discussed the contradictions and differences between those laws that make us think that H is a separate author. And then we get to Numbers, we're going to jump back to P, and then we'll find some of the other authors. So you'll see that in a second. One of the main kind of takeaways from that was I asked the question, what does this mean about trusting the Bible? Specifically because we had these differences in laws from H and P. And then we contrasted P with D and some other things like that. Now this is the for those of you who are new, this is kind of the history of the different sources that we believe were put together to create the first 5 books of the Bible, and the dating of some of these different sources and kind of the label we give to each of them. And one of the things we said was that if your interest is in proof texting, which will come up today when we start talking about abortion, if your interest is proof texting, God said it, this is what you need to be, how you need to believe, then the existence of separate sources and contradictions between the worldview, theology, and laws of the different sources makes that challenging. It should challenge you. If you believe the Bible is this book you can use to proof text morality and how you should behave. However, if you're a historian, the fact that the person, the redactor, who put these sources together did not correct all the disagreements, didn't merge them together and change the text so that it all fit, the fact that he didn't do that allows us as a historian to trust the Bible more. In other words, the contradictions for a historian make us trust it more, whereas for a proof texter, they're challenging. Because what they mean is that the Bible was preserved, and its sources, to some degree, disagreements and all, were preserved. They were munged together without citation or description of when you're switching sources. But the original, earlier beliefs were preserved, and preserved contradictions and all. The redactor was well aware of the disagreements in the text and the potential contradictions. He knew they were there, and yet he chose to preserve these texts whole regardless. And so again, from the perspective of biblical scholarship and history, this is a reason to trust the text, not a reason to distrust it. But unless your goal is proof texting, which again, we're going to come to when we discuss abortion in a minute. Now we're going to introduce the book of Numbers. So after we get through the book of Leviticus, the author is P, then the author switches to H, and then as we begin the book of Numbers, it will switch back to P again. The book's title in Hebrew is Bamidbar, or In the Wilderness. That's the third Hebrew line of the text. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness. In Hebrew, that's the third word of the text. And it's descriptive of what happens here. This is a discussion of what Israel does in the wilderness. The Latin name is numere, which is where we get numbers. That comes from the Greek, which was arithmoi, which is where we get arithmetic. So the Greek text was named arithmoi in the translation. Maybe a preferred title, if I was going to label this, I would call it Wandering. This is the book of wandering, and that's a description of what Israel does. They wander in the wilderness here. So, if I want to outline the text, what we need to do is, there are two different ways to do it. Three. You can do this by the generations. There's the first generation and the second generation. And each of those is prefaced by a census. And that's why it's called the book of Numbers, because it has this census in it. It has two of them, one for the first generation, one for the second. And these two censuses count the military-aged people, the people you could muster for war, because what they're doing in the first generation is they're getting ready to go conquer the land. And if you remember the story of Numbers, they take a census, they march to the land, they send spies, the spies come back and say, the land is great, but it's full of giants, which we could have a whole discussion about Hebrew mythology around giants. But it's got giants in the land, and there's big walled cities, and there's no way we can do this. We'll never conquer the land, and we should all be afraid. And God becomes mad at the people, and he says, you're all going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Once you die off, I'll raise up a new generation that will trust me. And they will enter the land and conquer the land. So they wander for 40 years. They all die off. Then Joshua takes over after Moses dies, and then they enter the land. So the second generation begins with the second census, again, of military-aged men. And the second census is only about 3% less than the first. So once the first generation dies off, even though they're wandering in the wilderness, their population does not shrink more than 3%. So according to the census. Now, the census, I don't remember the exact numbers, but what's interesting about the census is that if you kind of estimate, if they have that many military-aged males, what's the full population of women, children, older men? You end up with about a couple million, and it doesn't make sense. Like, that population of that size is too large, so we assume it's exaggerated. So that's the first way you can divide the book into two parts, the first generation and the second. The other way to do it is with three locations. You begin at Mount Sinai, and again, just like remember, the second half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and Numbers 1 through 10, verse 10, all happen at Sinai. Sinai is the place for most of the action of the whole Pentateuch. Pentateuch being the first 5 books of the Bible. And so that first bit of Numbers is just like the book of Leviticus. It's rules for the people and the priests, but in this case, it's rules for the people and the priests as they get ready to march off. So they're marching off rules for the most part. And that's what we have in this first chunk, in 1 to 10. And then in 10 to 21, we have the wilderness journey as they travel to the promised land. That's when they get there, is in 22. And of course, that's when we have this whole spies and they get afraid, and then you get the second generation. So that's the first. You can do it into 2 generations or 3 locations, which is the second bit there. The other way to do it is with these key events. There's the holiness and the camp, and there's the holiness rules for the priests on how to march. It's much like Leviticus, except it's Leviticus on the march. Then you get the holiness of the tabernacle, and that's these events. Then you can get the wilderness journey has departure from Sinai and a rebellion and death of the people in the first generation. Then they have threats. They're threatened on the plains of Moab, and then they have a preparation for entering the promised land after the second census. So you can also divide it up into kind of these 6 key events. And you'll notice they also kind of fit along some of the same divisions of locations and events. I can also divide this out into more detail, and I believe what I'm going to do is try to flesh this out so that we have kind of a list of all the stories. There's no way you can read this, that's fine. But what I'll do is I think I'll put this up as a handout on the web, and I'll bring it to my next class so that you can have kind of a list of the stories in the book of Numbers. This is Numbers in more detail. But let's just kind of zoom in on the pieces we're going to cover today. And that's chapter 1 through 10:10. And that includes those two parts, the commands for the census and the commands for the purity of the people. Again, we're not going to cover every chapter, but I do want to cover the organization of the tribes in chapters 2, 3, and some of 4. And then in 5, we'll have this test for purity and the law of jealousy, which is the chapter that is sometimes discussed in conjunction with the abortion debate. And then in chapter 6, I'm going to discuss the Aaronic benediction. And the rest, we just don't have time to cover everything. So those are the pieces we're going to talk about. So marching. When we've talked about the temple, I know I've brought this sort of idea up before, but the temple and God's place in the Holy of Holies is placed at the center of the camp. And so when they march, at least this is how it's described. It's probably retrodicted, so it's a later idea put back in time, but it's described as this orderly march of millions of people centered around, with tents centered around the tabernacle in the center. But what the author is doing, this is all P material, is he's trying to make order. He's describing this ordered march because P cares about order. For him, righteousness is related to order and organization. He's the guy that gave us the 7 days of creation, right? So for the 7 days of creation, that orders the creation. So when Israel marches to the promised land, of course, they have to be organized as well. The organization P gives us tells us something, probably more about P than it tells us about how Israel actually marched. For example, the Levites are placed in the center. P is a priestly source, and so they get a pride of place. Moses and Aaron are placed on the right side of on the east side of the temple, and there's by the door. The opening to the temple gives you the most holy place. So God is in the middle, and Moses and Aaron and the priests march on the east side by the entrance to the temple. The other Levite tribes surround the tabernacle on the northwest and south. Those are the Levites. So you get the priests, Moses and Aaron, and the Levites on the left, on the rest of the sides. And then who does he put on the eastern side in the camp? Now this drawing has Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. It puts Judah at the top. I suspect Judah's in the middle. All we know is the text lists those three on the eastern side. Why those three? Well, the author was probably Jewish. And where do we get the term Jewish? A descendant of the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah is important for the Jewish people, and it has a pride of place in Hebrew tradition. In fact, if we look at the story that he tells about the origin of the family, Judah is one of the sons of Jacob's first wife, Leah. And we have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. He's the third child, and then Issachar, Zebulun, and then a daughter, Diana. Dinah, is that right? Yeah, Dinah. Excuse me. And so what's happened? Why does Judah jump to the front? Well, Levi was made the priest, so Levi's out because he's already got a greater pride of place. He's the priest. P is probably, I said this badly. P is probably of the tribe of Levi. He's a priest, probably. He's concerned with priestly stuff. But he probably is living in the nation of Judah with kings from the tribe of Judah. So we have the priests and the kings. So Judah makes sense because Levi is already moved inside. But we also have Simeon and Reuben. And if you remember in the book of Genesis, those two have problems where their father sort of doesn't disown them, but kind of moves them down the pecking order. And it's because Reuben sleeps with his concubine, his father's concubine, bad idea. And Simeon massacres a town, and Jacob didn't appreciate that. Apparently was trying to get along with the people around him. And so when he massacres this particular town, he is also demoted. And that leaves... after Levi is made the priest, that leaves Levi as kind of the oldest son, so he gets the priesthood, and then that leaves Judah as next, and he gets the kingship he gets the nation of Judah. And so later the Israel will be divided into two nations, Judah and Israel. Israel is the nation in the north, and they will be taken captive into Assyria and never return. Judah is the one tribe that survives the exile kind of whole, and that's why we call them the Jews today. So this text was written at a time when the Jews were the central tribe. Right? They were the tribe that had survived, and so they get pride of place. So we see their importance later in time reflected back on these early stories of where they marched and also what happened to the family that made them so privileged. We also have, in Jacob, the Bible has polygamous people in it, but it doesn't necessarily imply that it's a good idea because these people struggle. And Jacob struggles to think of all of his wives equally, and he has a favorite wife, and she has two children, Joseph and Benjamin, and her children are here on the western side. But you'll notice Joseph doesn't have a place here. So 12 is this nice magical number. You want to keep 12 tribes. Jacob had 12 sons. That's all great. But then you make one of them the priest. You need 12 again. So what do you do? Well, you take his favorite child, Joseph, who got the coat of many colors and had all this sibling rivalry because of it. And he gets 2 portions. And so Joseph had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they get kind of promoted to tribe status, and that gets us back to 12. So this is Joseph's 2 sons here, and Rebekah's other son, Benjamin here. Rachel, sorry. And then we have Zebulun, the other tribes here. Okay, so enough of that. What's important here is that we are seeing a later reality reflected back on this earlier time. Which brings us to Numbers chapter 5, the test for purity and the law of jealousy. This is a discussion of adultery and what to do. Excuse me, let me fix this. What to do if you suspect your wife has been guilty of adultery, what a man should do if he suspects his wife is guilty of adultery. So to give this some context, though, I want to talk about what I think, and opinion warning before we begin, but I want to say what I think the Pentateuch, now I'm not talking about the Bible as a whole, because later Paul has more puritanical views and things, but the Pentateuch's, the early Hebrew authors' views of sexuality were. I believe that all the sexual restrictions in the Pentateuch center around one of 3 things. Sexual purity, and by this I mean ritual sexual purity. This is about having sex during menstruation. This is about being impure if you have menstruation. This is about being impure if you have an ejaculation. And this impure is not sinful, but it requires 7 days or something of purification before you go back to the temple. And as the temple is so holy, you want to keep these bodily fluids away from it. And it's not that these things are sinful, it's just we need to stay ritually pure. So the first set of restrictions all have to do with ritual purity, and none of them imply that sex is bad. The next is sexual taboos. These involve things like incest, having sex with animals, and famously, male homosexuality. But weirdly, not female homosexuality. It's not mentioned at all. Female homosexuality seems fine, but male homosexuality, for whatever reason, was a taboo that this culture said you shouldn't do. And the final sexual restrictions have to do with inheritance laws. Now, what I want to point out is that there is this later view that all sex outside of marriage is bad and deeply sinful. And then there's even a puritanical view that all sex is sinful unless you're having children or something like this. There is no evidence of that idea in this text. And in fact, if we look at things like the Song of Solomon, which is erotic love poetry, bordering pornographic, it's so explicit, that indicates a sex-positive view of at least some of the people at this time. Now, it's hard to give the biblical view because each of these biblical authors had slightly different ideas and views on this. That we would expect the different sources to disagree maybe about some of the sexual issues. But I would argue that these are the main concerns. And let me give you an example. Judah and Tamar. We discussed that back in lecture 12. But if I'm going to remind you of the story, Judah has 3 children. The first one marries Tamar and then dies without children. The second one marries Tamar and dies without children. And Judah is supposed to marry her to the third one so that he can raise up posterity, right? This is all about inheritance. The third one is supposed to marry her so that she can have posterity and he can have posterity. This is about continuing his priestly line. It's essential. All of Judaism, the Jews wouldn't exist if Judah did not have children. So there's some concern here. And he's got this third child, but he doesn't marry her to Tamar because all his other children who married Tamar died. And he's like, she's bad luck. If I marry her to my other child, he might die too. So I'm not going to marry Tamar. I'm just going to leave her single, and I'm going to leave him single and do nothing about this. And he keeps putting it off and putting it off and putting it off until she gets sick of it. She dresses like a prostitute, hangs out on the roadside, and intercepts Judah walking down the road and seduces him. And he says, okay, and he sleeps with Tamar, and then she asks for payment, and he doesn't have anything to pay her with, so he gives her his rod and his signet ring and says, you can use this as proof of what we've just done, so you can come back and get payment later. She says, that's great, takes off, and then gets pregnant. Suddenly, Judah finds out that his wife, that Tamar, who's supposed to be engaged to his youngest son, they just haven't been married yet, is pregnant. And he says, oh no, let's put her to death. She's done this horrible thing. We're going to put her to death. Now, I want you to just see the irony of some of this in the story. It's intended by the biblical authors. Like you look at this and go, this isn't fair, this isn't right. And then she stands up and says, you see this rod and staff? This is the father of my child. And Judah says, now this is the strange bit. You have been more righteous than I. And nothing happens to her, nothing happens to him. Okay? So what's happening here is a broader picture of ancient Jewish society where prostitution was accepted. It was not even, they did not put prostitutes to death. They did not put men who slept with prostitutes to death. They probably did not put people who slept with people before they were married to death. But if you were married or engaged and you slept with somebody, now that is worthy of death. In fact, I think the definition of the Hebrew adultery might just refer to that sexual situation and none of the others. Maybe. Because there seems to be less concern about these other things. You can sleep with a prostitute, it's okay, no one cares. You can be a prostitute, it's okay, no one, at least we're not going to put you to death. In fact, Rahab is a prostitute. We're going to see her as a great hero in the later story. Right? So there is no sense that this is morally bad. What's morally bad is when you have sex with somebody, to these people, in a way that might cause the wrong person to inherit. Because if I have sex with your wife and she has a child and that child inherits your money I just stole from you. I didn't steal your wife from you or your prerogative with your wife. That's not what's important here. I stole your property because I got my child to inherit your stuff. And so that is a sin, a bad action legally that makes me worthy of death, even if I'm a male, and it makes a female worthy of death if your wife allows this. So both males and females involved in that sort of adultery are put to death, but people who wander around having sex with prostitutes, it's okay, which is a strange ethical world to live in. They cared a lot about children. They cared a lot about posterity. That's why Tamar is so concerned that she have a child. They cared about this. This is why Abraham is so upset that he doesn't have a child. It's essential to their way of thinking. Okay, so I want to give that as context to what then follows. Now, I also don't want to imply that there isn't sexism involved. They did treat women differently than men. There were double standards here. But the primary issue is inheritance. And if we start with that belief, that will help us, I think, make sense of this text and what's happening in it. This is a test for purity in Numbers chapter 5. We could read this whole thing. It's not long, but I'm not going to. We just have to, I think, summarize it. And this is the material in the text. If a husband is jealous of his wife, or he thinks she has committed adultery, but there are no witnesses, that's essential, because if there are witnesses, the solution is you put her and the man she slept with to death. But if there are no witnesses, then what he does is he brings her to the temple, and he brings a barley offering to the priest. And then the priest makes, quote, the water that brings the curse. Well, what the heck is that? Well, it says that he takes holy water. This is the only time the term holy water is used in the entire Bible. We have an association for that through Catholicism, but this probably doesn't mean the same thing. It could just mean water that is pure, meaning water from a running stream versus a stagnant pond. That was considered pure versus impure water issues, running water. It could mean water from the laver in the temple. That's my preferred solution, is temple water, which is a little closer to what Catholics would call holy water. But there's no description of blessing the water or anything like that. But he takes holy water, again, the only time that term is used. And then they take dust from the tabernacle floor. Now, I want to give you an idea of what is in that dust from the tabernacle floor, because the tabernacle is a place where you bring goats and sheep and you kill them and you pour their blood out on the side of the altar into the dust. And depending on where you get this dust, it's probably got bacteria in it. This is going to become, I think, important as to why this became a ritual. Then you dishevel her hair, probably a sign of mourning. Who knows why they're disheveling her hair? But she kneels before the priest. They dishevel her hair, uncover her head, dishevel her hair. They place the grain offering in her hand, and she gives an oath where she basically says, I have not committed adultery. I am innocent. And if I'm lying, may I be cursed. And then the priest takes the flour from her hand and burns it on the altar. And then the woman drinks the water. And then judgment is issued not by the priest but by God. If she's innocent, the water has no effect. If she's guilty, she's cursed. And we'll talk about the curse in just a minute. This is very clearly a kind of a magic how to determine if someone is guilty or innocent of adultery ritual. It's the sort of thing we also see in penalty rituals from the Hittites and other places in the ancient Near East. In fact, I think I gave you a list of some similar rituals from Hittites in earlier lectures. I should go back and find those. But this is not the sort of thing this is not unlike the sort of thing we see in all the nations around Israel. It's a common sort of thing. But it only sort of works if they had noticed that drinking this sort of dust and water had a chance, a random chance of making someone sick or of having no effect, which we can imagine now that we understand where disease come from. They didn't understand where disease came from. So what is the curse? This is the King James. I'm going to start here because it'll be clear that they have no idea. And when he hath made her to drink the water, he the priest hath made her, the woman accused of adultery, to drink the water, then it shall come to pass that if she be defiled and hath done trespass against her husband, that the water that causeth the curse shall enter into her and become bitter. This bitter term in Hebrew is merar, and also related to, we think, the root for the word Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus, and they make puns on the word bitter when describing Mary. There are similarities between Mary's situation and this one. A woman who suddenly became pregnant while she was engaged to someone else, just like Judah and Tamar. That's also related. And the authors of the text make vague allusions to this. And there's several reasons why Mary's story is a terribly sad one, right? Her son dies, and she says, my sword pierced me also, and bitter. So the term bitter and Mary are connected. So there's something going on here that later Christian authors pick up on in comparisons to Mary. But anyway, it will enter into her and become bitter, and her belly shall swear, and her thigh shall rot. Her thigh shall rot. I have no idea what that means. And the woman shall be cursed among the people. And if the woman be not defiled and be clean, then she shall be free. And here we go, and shall conceive seed. In other words, she won't be infertile. So this has something to do with infertility and be a curse among her people, where her belly swells and her thigh shall rot. Well, what is... Let's turn to some other translations, because the King James was done back before we really knew well how to read Hebrew, and see if we can make more sense of this. This is the NRSV. It says, the water that brings the curse shall enter into her and cause bitter pain, and her womb shall discharge, her uterus drop, And the woman shall become an execration, a cursed thing among her people. But if the woman was not defiled herself and is clean, she shall be immune and be able to conceive children. Something is swelling and something is dropping. And it has to do with terms that maybe have something to do with a uterus, a thigh, a reproductive organ, a belly. And so if you want to kind of make sense of this, I think drinking water mixed with dirt from the floor of a place where animals live can easily cause dysentery, swelling bellies, diarrhea, and possibly miscarriage. That's just kind of a medical assessment from a non-medical person about what might happen if you physically, literally did this thing. Let's look at the NIV and see what it does. Now, the NIV is an evangelical translation, so it's always good to get their contrasted view. It says, she's made to drink the water that brings a curse and causes bitter suffering. It will enter her abdomen, will swell, and her womb will miscarry. They're straight up saying it. Her womb will miscarry. And she will become a curse. If, however, the woman has not made herself impure, but is clean, she will be cleansed of guilt and will be able to have children. What does this have to do with abortion? Well, this has been interpreted as a divine miscarriage, a divinely induced miscarriage. In other words, an abortion. That she drinks so here's the idea. The man comes, finds his wife pregnant, and is like, I didn't do that. I think she cheated on me, but there's no witness. So you take her to the temple, and you need to make sure if the child isn't yours. Remember what I said about the purpose of all these sexual laws is inheritance. In that context, he takes her to the temple. He says, I think this child might not be mine. So she does this thing. If it is his, then nothing happens, and the child is born, and it's his. If it's not his, well, God will cause an abortion. So this has been used, on the TikTok warrior pro-choice side of the debate to try to say God clearly approves of abortion because God performs abortions for people the Bible says God performs abortions for people when people are cheating. So I want to make a couple comments. The first is, it's actually never said that the woman is pregnant when this happens. She could be, but it doesn't specify that. And also at the end it says she'll be able to have children. There is an alternate interpretation that this is a forced infertility, that she'll become infertile and not be able to bear future children. You can use that to explain this away and say this isn't a divinely inspired abortion. There are people who do that. So I don't want you to interpret my opinion of abortion based on what I just said. I have an opinion, but I haven't shared it, and that's not the point. The point is to figure out the text. And what I'm saying is this passage about belly swelling and things rotting or falling or discharging is a slew of Hebrew words that probably made sense to them that we are struggling to interpret. It could have to do with, for all I know, a swollen belly and dysentery and have nothing to do with abortion. I don't know. So I believe that this is poor evidence that God approves of abortion. Now again, when I say that, I shouldn't even say that God approves, that the Bible says that God approves of abortion. This is poor evidence that the Bible says that God approves of abortion. Having said that, don't interpret what my opinion of abortion is on that, because I want to be objective. Like if I'm pro-choice and I don't think this text is concrete evidence that the Bible is pro-choice, that's what I'm saying, right? I'm not telling you what you should believe about abortion. I'm just talking about this text. Does this text prove that the Bible is in favor of abortion and is pro-choice? It doesn't. But it is intriguing. And it also at least shows that a very reasonable interpretation of this text involves a divinely inspired, instigated abortion. That is a reasonable interpretation of this text. So if you're on the other side of this debate and you're pro-life, and you come to me and say, the Bible says so, show me. Because there are at least one passage where the Bible maybe says the opposite. And so my argument is the Bible says nothing here or elsewhere about abortion, and you're going to have to solve that problem a different way. Let me also turn to Exodus 21. This is the other text. I believe there are two texts that are relevant. And both of them are inconclusive. So this is the other one. Exodus 21, verse 22 through 23. This is the King James. If men strive and hurt a woman with child so that her fruit depart from her, sounds like she has a miscarriage, and yet no mischief follow after the miscarriage, then he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and as pay as the judges determine. But if any mischief follow, meaning if the woman dies, presumably, after having this miscarriage, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And there's what happens if you hit a woman and she miscarries, you pay a fine. What happens if you hit a woman and she dies? You're put to death, depending on what kind of mischief follow. That has been interpreted by Jewish commentators as a belief that the woman's life supersedes that of the child. There's a Jewish principle called pekuach nefesh, or to save a life, and it's based on a passage in the Bible that says, these are the laws that thou shalt live in them. And what they mean, and what later Jewish Talmudic authors have interpreted that as saying, is that the point of the laws are to give you ways to live. They're to improve your life. And anything that saves a life supersedes all these laws. Because if I have to eat pork to save a life, I should eat pork. If I have to fight on the Sabbath to save life, I should fight on the Sabbath. This is why Jews will fight on the Sabbath. And they did so in the 7-day war, et cetera, et cetera. And the principle in Talmudic interpretation is pekuach nefesh. They will put that principle against the one in Exodus, and they will say, if a woman's life is in jeopardy through a pregnancy, and you do not commit abortion, they will go this far. If you do not have an abortion when her life is in jeopardy, you're not pekuach nefeshing, and it's wrong. Because abortion is almost mandated because the woman's life is more important than the child's. This is a Jewish interpretation of this text. It is not the only interpretation of this text, however. The NRSV says, so by the way, the King James is kind of traditional American. NRSV is kind of a biblical scholarship. This is what you would use normally in a college class. And the NIV is an evangelical text. So I'm going to use those three. So you get the scholarly impression, kind of the traditional impression, and the evangelical impression. So here's the NRSV. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman, so that there is a miscarriage, yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine, because he's the one who lost an inheritance, by the way. You see that? It's this concept of inheritance. It's not that I want to make a comment that we have interpreted this as women in the Old Testament were property, and that's not the case. The child a woman can have is the property and is the central concern, I think. That's my reading of these texts. But anyway, paying as much as the judges demand, and if harm follows, then you shall give eye for eye, tooth. So this eye for eye, tooth for tooth is a very famous phrase, but this is the context in which it was given. But now I want to show you the NIV. I want to show you how they kind of weasel out of this. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury to the woman or the child, presumably, then the offender must be fined whatever the woman husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, again, presumably to the woman or the child, then you are to take eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So the traditional Jewish interpretation is this passage shows that the woman's life was considered superior to an unborn child's life in Torah. The evangelical interpretation doesn't like that because they see the infant as being as equally important as the woman, and so they kind of retranslate the text, and it's not an entirely crazy interpretation of the Hebrew. It's not what I think is most likely. I think the NRSV is the most likely reading of the text, but it is not impossible. So here again, we have just enough ambiguity to say that you cannot answer this question or settle this question by an appeal to the Bible one way or another. And so if you know me, I don't believe that we should be answering moral questions this way anyway. But I'm still going through this debate because I know there are those who believe in the biblical text, who believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, who will want to try to answer this question from the biblical text. So we'll go through the arguments, but proof texting is a problem. It's a problem because there are multiple sources, multiple authors. They have different opinions. It's also difficult because we don't know what some of these Hebrew phrases referred to. Did the belly swell and the thigh? Does that mean she had a miscarriage, or does that mean she had an abortion, or does that mean she becomes infertile, or does that mean she has dysentery and a swollen belly? We do not know for sure, and so there are at least several problems with this, and one of them is in biblical interpretation. We don't know what the text is really saying for certain, and there's enough uncertainty there that you can't answer the question. And even if you did know what the text said, you would then have to be faced with the issue of multiple authorships, multiple opinions, and then you'd have to answer the question, why are we basing our morality on the religious beliefs of people from the Iron Age who are telling this story? Even if you believe in God, what we believe about the Bible is that this is God's people telling the story as best they can from their perspective. Because if you don't do that, next class we're going to get to Numbers, and God is going to command a genocide, and you're going to have to answer another question. Are you going to defend biblical inerrancy at the expense of God's character? Because the God, as described in Numbers, in next class, or the class after, depending on how fast we move through this text, is going to command genocide, and then is going to mention, and leave all the virgins alive so that you can keep them for yourself. Think about what that might mean. Will you defend biblical inerrancy over God's character? And if you won't defend biblical inerrancy, if you will, and you stick with biblical inerrancy, you're still stuck with the fact that you don't actually know what these passages mean. And there is at least, if you're a pro-life person, there is at least an argument to be made that these texts have pro-choice interpretations, and that they may even be the most likely interpretation. Again, do not interpret my opinion of abortion from this discussion before now, that previous discussion. All I've wanted to talk about is interpreting the biblical text, and then whether the biblical text answers the question for us. Once we're faced with the fact that this may not answer the question, we have to find another way to answer it. And here we have to deal with ethical and theological questions that are incredibly difficult, incredibly complicated, and hard, and where there are a lot of reasonable opinions on both sides. We have to balance issues of life and bodily autonomy. We have to ask questions like, when does life begin? When does consciousness begin? What is the responsibility that we owe potential life? To what degree does one person's bodily autonomy supersede the life of another person if that fetus is another person? For example, I'm going to give you some examples. Mask mandates. I'm going to violate your bodily autonomy to save another person's life. Or kidney transplants. If you could save another person's life with a kidney transplant, then another person's life is dependent on your bodily autonomy. You could choose to do that, but can government force you to do that? Even if it saves another person's life, should government be able to force you to have a kidney transplant? Maybe, maybe not, depends. What about to wear a mask? What about to get vaccinated? And you probably have different opinions about all of those. These are the questions we're faced with abortion. I have a convicted opinion about what is best. That is best to let the woman and her doctor choose. I have reasons for believing that that is best. I have reasons for believing that that is the right answer to the question, but that's my personal view. But what I hope is that we'll come to the conclusion that the Bible isn't going to answer this question for us, that we're faced with other ways of answering it, these other ethical questions we have to ask. And finally, that maybe we could stop maybe demonizing each other quite to the degree we have been, even though, and I'm not asking you to have less convicted view. You might think that a great deal of harm is caused by one view or the other. But if we recognize that it's at least a hard problem and that there are reasonable, good people with different opinions, maybe we can find a way to talk about it that is a little less polarizing. Okay. I'm going to end with a brief discussion of the, I don't mind, actually, that's a big break in topic. So does anyone have I can invite comments, questions, or thoughts, or we can just go on too. So, all right. Let's then do the Aaronic benediction. This is a very famous passage in Numbers chapter 6. And it will sound familiar to you, I think, if you've been to our sermons. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto Aaron and his sons, saying, thus shall you bless the Israelites. Because this is how you're going to bless the Israelites. You will say, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall you put my name on the Israelites, and I will bless them. This should sound familiar if you've been to Reverend John's sermons, right? A mix of this and some Mary Oliver. For this is the day, this is the one wild and precious life that we are given. So let us all find a way to rejoice and be glad in it. Go in peace. Comes from this passage. It's very famous, and it's used in most churches as in many churches at least, as a parting blessing on the congregation. One of the things that's interesting about this is the oldest Hebrew text with a biblical passage written on it comes from this passage, or is related to this passage. The Tekef Hinnom scrolls are two different metal amulets that were a silver plate, and the passage was written in silver on this plate, and then the plate was rolled up and buried with some people in a grave. And when they found this metal scroll, they unrolled it and they tried to read it. And of course, it cracked as they unrolled it, but you can sort of see what is here. And when you translate it, this is what you find. There are two of them. The top line, again, it's broken, but you'll notice these passage: the great one who keeps the covenant and gracious towards those who love him, and those who keep his commandments, the eternal, the blessed more than any something more than evil. For redemption is in him. For Yahweh is our restorer, our rock. And may Yahweh bless you, and may he keep you. May Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. Presumably, something like this. The bottom line is broken. The other scroll says, may he bless you, may you be blessed by Yahweh, the warrior, helper, and rebuker of evil. May bless Yahweh keep you. Make shine Yahweh his face upon you, and grant you peace. Again, the bottom line is broken. So this is a reference to this passage. Now, this is important for questions of dating. These passages are both from around 600 BC, BCE, probably a little bit after that, but just before the Babylonian captivity, maybe 580 BC. So probably in Israel, written by Jewish people before the Babylonian captivity. And so this is the oldest kind of biblical related text we have. And we're so used to making bumper stickers that quote from the Bible, right? That when we see a quote like this, we say, they're quoting the Bible. But I want to caution, we actually don't know this. The Bible could be quoting this. And in this case, what is this? It's a ritual incantation by the priest. This is how the priest blesses people at the temple. It's a priestly blessing. What this shows is that the ritual of the priestly blessing, as described in the book of Numbers, is pre-exilic and very old. What it does not show is that the book of Numbers is that old, or that a source for the book of Numbers is that old. Now, I think there are parts of the book of Numbers that are that old. There are parts that aren't. I think most of it was written pre-exilic, but I think there are parts that are old. It's possible, but we don't know. And so what I want to use is this is a great chance to kind of give some cautions about how we interpret this sort of material. It is incredibly interesting. It shows that the book of Numbers is quoting legitimate ancient Israelite ritual. So as the P author of the book of Numbers describes the priestly ritual, he's describing some old stuff, some old rituals, some old rites, old beliefs. That much it shows. Whether it shows that there were actual texts that were sources for him that were that old, pre-exilic, is harder to say. I think there were some, but again, we don't know that, and so we have to be careful. But this is, I think, incredibly, it's a famous passage. It's one you've heard before, one that we use, and it's the oldest biblical text we have access to, that we have kind of this ancient source for. So what are we going to do next time? There's a lot more to the book of Numbers. There's really, really fun stories. There's a serpent that you put up on a pole, and if you look at it, it heals you from snake bites. This is really fun stuff, especially since Christians will later compare it to Christ being lifted up on the cross. Really fun stuff with later implications. I'd love to talk about it. There's a great story of a mad prophet and his donkey. The second time in biblical history where animals talk to you. Those are fun stories. You get the talking snake and the talking donkey. That's a really fun story. And then we also have this very troubling story of the genocide of the Midianites. That one has political implications for the authors, and it helps us distinguish the authors because E and J are pro-Midianite and P is very anti-Midianite, and so P has this description of a Midianite genocide. So there's several, and there's also a great story of Moses taking water from a rock, which is a repeat of something we saw earlier in Exodus, but from a different source. One of them has it after, one has it before, but they're both telling this same tradition that they'd both heard, and they're putting it in their story. So you have another doublet of the water from the rock story, which is another evidence of multiple authorship. There is great stuff in the rest of the book of Numbers. What I have to do with the rest of my time is I'm going to, between now and next month, is I'm going to have to figure out which pieces of this to tell and which pieces to skip. I have an artist friend named Michael Lyon. He recently passed away. He was a beautiful artist, great visual artist, drew pictures, beautiful. He was also an illustrator for several books, drew beautiful illustrations. And he said to me, the real problem with art isn't putting beautiful things in, it's taking things out. It's limiting yourself because you want to talk about everything. You want to put everything in, but then it's too busy. It's limiting yourself. And the beauty of really good art is about exclusion, picking just a few things and leaving the rest out. So I'm going to have to figure out what we're going to cover and what we're not. Feel free to make recommendations. If there's some part of this you just want me to talk about, let me know. But I don't want to spend 8 classes on the book of Numbers. We'll probably spend 2 or 3. So in the next 2 classes, I'm going to have to figure out how much of this to cover and where. If you're looking for good additional material on the book of Numbers, episode 212 of the Bible for Normal People, titled Pete Ruins Numbers, is a beautiful source. He is more skeptical of Numbers 5, describing a divinely mandated, divinely caused miscarriage than I am. I think that's the most likely, but I admit to not being sure. He actually thinks that just divinely induced infertility is most likely. And for whatever reason, that's his interpretation. But he brings up both sides. He discusses the issue, and he also discusses the rest of the book of Numbers. It's really good, so I recommend that. And if you want extra credit, Pete also likes to ruin Genesis, Exodus, Isaiah, Deuteronomy. Very recently, he ruined Joshua. So again, for those of you wishing extra credit, there are episodes on all of those that I recommend. Pete is what I would describe as a liberal Christian, someone who does not believe in biblical inerrancy, but who respects the Bible, but is willing to say, there's stuff in this that is immoral and that we shouldn't follow, and I believe in God, but I don't believe in this. So if you're looking for kind of a middle way to go, he's a great both scholar and kind of walker of the ethical line that you have to when dealing with the text as a believer. So any burning thoughts, questions before we quit? All right, I'll see you next month, and thank you all for coming.